And a very good morning, and thank you very much for joining us on GBS Morning Extra. As I mentioned to you earlier before the break, today we'll be discussing about the demolitions that have been taking place in Nairobi, in parts of Nairobi, to be more precise in Ruai and Kariobangi areas. And just to give you a quick recap or a quick reminder is that 100 families earlier this week were forced to spend the night in the cold after government demolished their houses in Ruai. That was on Friday to Saturday night. The demolitions took place under the cover of darkness, leaving many of the families with no alternative place to go. But then earlier this month, the government started evictions of hundreds of people who had bought property next to a disputed 3,000-acre piece of land to pave way for the expansion of the Dandora Sewerage Treatment Plant in Ruai. Now, these demolitions have affected people in Ruai and as far as Kariobangi South Sewage Estate. And the Dandora Waste Sewerage Treatment Plant, which stands next to the properties that were demolished, was built in 1980 and was initially meant to serve about 80% of the city residents. Now, demolitions or no demolitions, this is no problem. But then there are guidelines on how to carry out demolitions. And somehow you want to ask yourself why the government should carry out demolitions at night, beg your pardon. Despite that, earlier, the government had actually promised that when the Kariobangi demolitions began, because those are the demolitions that began before they reached to Ruai, the government had promised through the Ministry of Interior that they would halt the process for about 4 months, just to allow the country to, wade through the COVID-19 pandemic. But a few hours after the statement was made by Dr. Matiang'i, we saw that night actually the demolitions were carried out. Now, today we are joined this morning on GBS Morning Extra by a very special guest, Horton Irongo, who is the country Amnesty International country director, is joining us this morning just to help us understand how these things work. Because earlier we had, asked many questions why the civil society is not making enough noise to, get the government to do the right thing. But then we're thankful that Horton Irongo is here with us today just to help us understand how these things work and what really should be done legally. Horton, good morning.
Good morning, and good morning, viewers. On behalf of Amnesty, it's a pleasure to be here this morning. I think the first thing we have to accept is that forced evictions are an affront. They are a violation of our constitutional principles and the right to housing. They are also a violation of international standards that ensure that every human being, regardless of their class, regardless of their status, that they have the right to shelter all the time, not just during a pandemic or not just during a heavy rainy season.
Yeah.
But this right is essentially shrined both in international law and in our constitution. We have had for the last 10 years guidelines on how to evict people should the state require to do so. In what we know about the sewage plant, essentially, is that there is a disputed area of land, and that this public land, originally what was public land, the state has now sought to reclaim that land in order to extend the sewage infrastructure across many, many parts of Nairobi. And it's linked also to investment and loans that we've received, or a grant that we received from the World Bank of $30 billion shillings. But I think the key thing for us in Amnesty is that you cannot evict people at a time like this. And we were very emphatic and extremely direct on this issue last week. We wrote an open letter with Pamoja Trust and the Housing Coalition to His Excellency the President, and we said that under no circumstances should families be plunged into into rubble and have their homes destroyed at a time of Corona, and at a time really where we have very heavy rains happening across the country. Sure. So I think for Amnesty it is very clear that this should not be happening at this time.
But then, when you look at the way that the demolitions were carried out, Mr. Irongo, you realize that these were, like you mentioned, completely violating human rights and also the set standards on how demolitions should be carried out. But then the government giving out its word and then negating on the same and going ahead to demolish. Right now, the government is actually the one encouraging people in Kenya to stay at home, to keep the social distancing. But then with that kind of a situation, then clearly those people cannot even adhere to those simple government rules.
Yes, I mean, I think the promise, which was not, it was actually issued by the Cabinet Secretary of Interior, but it was a presidential promise. And to quote him, he said that there is a presidential ban on all evictions at this time. And that recording was made available through it was actually took place in a moment where he was briefing senators who had been extremely concerned about the evictions in Kariobangi North. That statement is available on our Twitter timeline. It's on Friday. It was a Friday morning statement, and as you said, within hours we saw evictions. And as I believe last night, those evictions continued to render people homeless. I think it's important to look at this in a particular context. Yesterday, the Kenya National Bureau of Standards released their preliminary report on the economic hardships of Corona and COVID-19. Yeah. And let me just, for your viewers, let me just read out a couple of things that caught my eye.
Sure.
The first one was that 91% of the people they interviewed don't know when they're returning to work.
Yes.
51%, so 1 in 2 people that they interviewed have recorded an increase in transport costs, and 1 in 5 people didn't pay their rent on time because they had seen their incomes reduced or they had lost their jobs. So this is a particularly hard time for families, regardless of their class or regardless of their status. And it actually doesn't really matter whether the land that their properties sit on at this time are in dispute. I think for the purpose of the pandemic, we should really be seeing a moratorium for the next 3 months until we are able to essentially seek alternative options for these families. The guidelines that have been agreed over a decade ago are very clear. Evictions cannot take place without a court order.
Yes.
They cannot happen in the cover of darkness. They must happen during daylight. They must be accompanied by government officers, not simply demolition crews and the police. And then lastly, they cannot happen in what they call inclement weather. That is weather that is either rainy or cold. Frankly speaking, we are now entering the cold season, and we are in the rainy season. So even without the pandemic, this is the wrong time to evict people from their homes, even if there is a legitimate grievance around the way that they receive their titles or the way that they have been able to build in that area.
But then besides just, the guidelines that, govern on how evictions should be carried out, isn't this also a bad timing for the government? Because with the pandemic and with all that is going on, I mean, you just read out the report by the Kenya National Bureau of Statistics, which is very true. And most of the families that are, reside in those areas, you realize are people who, I'm sorry to say this, but the reality is they live under $1 a day. Most of them are just casual laborers who go to work and, it's hand to mouth for them. No savings whatsoever, which you may say that, I mean, if such an incident happens at night, then by tomorrow, one would at least get some temporary shelter for themselves. And the government has not so far provided for them any shelter as we speak right now.
No, I mean, I think the thing that particularly pains most Kenyans is that this happened in the cover of darkness. It happened during the period of curfew. So not only are you unable to move anywhere for several hours, which means that you are going to be sleeping in the dark and possibly, during the rain. But at the same time, with the intercession of movement or the cessation of movement across the counties, you cannot leave Nairobi. So if you had an upcountry home, if you had relatives that you wanted to stay with, this is no longer possible for you under the COVID period. And I think, as we've said, we're 2 months into the pandemic. We've already started to see people defaulting on their rent.
Sure.
It's very hard times, particularly for the 85% of the population that are in the informal sector. for many daily wage earners, some of them have not worked. I mean, for the cases of Kariobangi North in particular, you have got people who are daily laborers. They are either construction workers, security officers, or domestic workers. And the economy has really, for them, begun to dry down and dwindle. Therefore, they don't have the savings that are required to make a major shift, like moving your whole house and finding another home.
Indeed, but then, Mr. Irungu, let me just mention a little bit of disappointment from the public, especially when it comes to the participation of civil society in such a situation. I don't know if whether it's about the pandemic, but then a little bit earlier, before that, we would see the civil society come out very strongly from all sectors. Good thing, Amnesty International reached out, and of course on social media, we can be able also to see that, the comments that you made, and also you mentioned that the letter you wrote to the president concerning the evictions. But then, is that all that we can do for these families? Is that how far we can push just to get the government to do the right thing for these families as civil society? Because I mean, you guys are the watchdog. You guys are the ones that can, put the government on check and get them to do the right thing.
So, we believe we live in a democracy, and that democracy allows us various levels of influence and various levels of power. And I think what we saw last week with Kariobangi North was a combined set of actions, both in the Senate and the National Assembly. Parliamentarians came out and spoke very publicly. The senator from Nairobi was very public and assertive in terms of his positions in Senate. And from the interview with the Interior Minister, I think the pressure was felt by the executive that actually this is not the time to do this. And I was very happy with the statement that came out of the Interior Ministry as a result of these initiatives, and also the initiative of the press. I mean, I think the more that the press continues to report on the damage and the cost of a forced eviction, the more that the conscience of the state begins to be pricked. The state is a complex institution. It is many, many multi-agencies working at the same time. So I think if we continue to press and articulate ourselves, this is immoral, it is unacceptable, and it is an affront to any sense of decency and a sense of protection and safety for these people, then I think we start to things shift. I can't speak for the whole of civil society. I can speak for my organization, the Housing Coalition. We were active on Kariobangi North. We have not been so active on Rai. I acknowledge that, and I think we need to increase our levels of advocacy and lobbying, not just within the state, but also publicly, so that the people of Rai who have lost their homes at this time, they do feel that they are supported, at least in terms of the manner in which the evictions took place, which, as I said, we cannot accept to be the correct way to manage any dispute over public land at this time. Well, we are also beginning to to think about whether we need more legal guarantees for Kenyans and for the government also to support their, I guess, their needs to reclaim land where it has been grabbed. And I'm not saying, that we as Amnesty are supportive of the argument that these are essentially fraudulent claims, because as we hear, many of the families there have been paying rates to the County of Nairobi. Yes. And I think those are legal matters that need to be best sorted in a court of law, not by demolition crews and tippers and bulldozers. That for me is not the sign of a country that believes in the rule of law or a sense of democratic fairness.
Very true indeed. As you mentioned, some of the families that we spoke to there actually had, have been paying fees to the county government. But then really, thank you, Bonahoto Nirongo, for finding time and also speaking to us. And maybe going forward, right now, early this morning, I caught you in some activity. Maybe you just want to share with our viewers what you're doing right now?
Yeah, thank you. So I'm actually I'm in a mall in Kilimani, and in the next 15 minutes or so, we're expecting about 100 women. These are essentially daily wage earners. They are domestic workers that have lost their jobs since the outbreak of COVID-19,
COVID-19,
and many of them have not had a daily contract or any form of payment for 2 months. So they're beginning to struggle with their rent, and a number of residents in the Kilimani area under the auspices of the Kilimani Project Foundation have come together, and we're now raising resources to be able to feed their families during this period. So it's an interesting one, because I know we've seen a lot of people going into the urban informal settlements to provide food supplies, but this is one of the first ones that I've seen in a lower middle class area where we are actually supporting the people that have been essential for our homes over this period. And it's a time like this that we should not forget them also.
Yeah, I mean, it is indeed true to explain that, because one would ask themselves, why Kilimani? Why not, Kariobangi, or why not, Kibera and stuff? But then, indeed, very true. These are people also who work in the locality, and it is good to remember them. Thank you very much, Mr. Houghton Irongo. We will want to speak to you later, maybe in the week or in the coming days, just to keep track of the situation and to get maybe some feedback from what you guys are doing there.
It's always a pleasure, and I'm very happy to come back at any time, Timothy.
Thank you. Have a good day.
Have a great day.
Yeah, stay safe. Well, viewer, that was Houghton Irongo, the country director, Amnesty International. And he's been speaking to us and also outlining some very important issues here in regard to the evictions that have been taking place in Kariobangi, in Ruai, in terms of, the repossession of land that was set aside for the expansion of the Dandora sewage treatment plant. Now, for those who do not, know the details about this, about more than 100 families right now in Ruai are still in the cold since Saturday night, when the government moved in to carry out demolitions in the middle of the night, leaving many of the families with no alternative place to go. Earlier this month, the government had actually started an eviction of hundreds of people who had bought property next to the disputed 3,000-acre piece of land to pave way for the expansion of the Dandora sewage treatment plant in Ruai in Nairobi. Now, the Dandora sewage treatment plant, which stands next to the property that was repossessed last month by the government, was built in 1980 and was initially meant to serve about 80% of city residents. It is indeed a good initiative, but many questions have arisen from the way that the government did carry out the eviction, which was according to law and according to the set standard of evictions. We had Mr. Houghton Irongo read out some of these instructions to us, is that the evictions should be carried out in broad daylight, should not be carried out at night, and also that the eviction should not be carried out in season. That is meaning, when there's, of course, maybe it's a cold season or the rainy season like we are experiencing right now, and also, accompaniment by, the demolition crew should be accompanied by government officials, and also there should be a court order. But funny enough is that in this situation, we've had the government even negate some court orders that had stopped them from carrying out the eviction. Now, the Ruai eviction came after the Kariobangi eviction, which actually prompted the members of parliament and members of Senate to, take the matter to the doorstep of the president, who later, through a directive that was, of course, communicated by the Minister for Interior, Dr. Fred Matiang'i, the government promised to cease the demolition for about 4 months until at least the country goes through the COVID-19 pandemic. But a few hours after that, we noticed that the demolitions were carried out. Well, we'll be following up on the story, and as we spoke to Houghton Irongo, we'll also be following up with him just to know what the civil society is doing as they continue to push and pile more pressure onto the government to cease the demolition and also alternatively provide somewhere for these families to go. Well, that brings us to the end of this segment of GBS Morning Extra. Thank you very much for joining us. To keep the conversation going, let's do that using our hashtag GBS Morning Extra. Our Twitter handle is GBS TV Africa. Our Facebook page is GBS TV Africa, and our YouTube is also GBS TV Africa. You can send us an SMS on 21144. 21144 is the number. My name is Timothy Omondi. Do you have yourself a lovely day, and I'll be seeing you again later today.